All right, welcome everybody to this, our tech interview seminar. So all of you are presumably here because you are interested in working in the tech industry and you're sort of curious about how one goes about approaching getting a job, what the application process is like, and once you get an interview, what that scenario in the interview room is going to be like for you. So our job here today, this is Melissa New and my name is Matthew Chartier, is to guide you through this process using our experience interviewing for companies previously to shed a little light on what exactly the process is like and what to expect going into interviews and teach you exactly what maybe you should be thinking about in approaching getting a job in the tech industry. All right, so just a brief overview of the topics we'll be including today in our presentation. Opportunities at Harvard. There are a wealth of opportunities here. If you're interested in working in the tech industry, you're very fortunate to be at Harvard right now. Companies essentially are going to be coming to you, and we're going to show you how to exploit that in order to gain the best advantages for yourself and make the best use of your time here to position yourself nicely to get in a great job that you're going to enjoy. Talk about resumes, how to format your resume for a tech company, what exactly they're looking for, what you should include, what maybe you shouldn't include. We'll talk about the format of interviews, what sort of questions you're going to be asked, how to get ready, how to present yourself while answering questions, what exactly they're looking for when they're talking to you, what sort of tech questions you'll be getting in the interview and how you might go about answering them, and following up with recruiters after the interview process is completed to determine what the details of an offer might be or to determine when a second round might take place if it was a first round interview. So just to reiterate, there are a lot of opportunities at Harvard. Companies like Facebook, Amazon, LinkedIn, Motorola, Microsoft, Google, they do on-campus recruiting here. And what that means is that for your first round, you'll be able to get an in-person interview with a recruiter right here at Harvard. You can go to the OCS interview complex. You sign up online through Crimson Careers. If you haven't checked out Crimson Careers already, you should definitely sign up. There's a lot of resources showing what the dates are for deadlines for signing up to take advantage of these opportunities and coordinating interviews with recruiters so you can get your foot in the door and introduce yourself to people from these companies. It's really easy at Harvard to get started with the process, and it provides a great backing for you in moving through the process with a lot of logistical support and advising.
So about some of the resources we have here, obviously, as Matt mentioned, there's the Office of Career Services, where there are a lot of companies who work directly with them and have sort of a partnership with them for different internships and jobs, and some interviews that are specifically for Harvard students. One thing to note is that they will have Harvard-specific policies, and so if you're going to be signing up through Crimson Careers, often there are going to be parts that companies are expecting you to, schedule an interview for, and you'll notice that you don't have access to them. And it's because you need to go through a quiz through the Crimson Careers about these policies, such as you can't decline a first-round interview for a second-round interview. Companies can't give you, countdowns of, say, oh, we offered 11 applicants, but there are only 10 spots. So just things like that are going to help you in the long run basically have a fair chance at any sort of opportunity that you might want. And there are also a lot of online sources and resources for things like resumes and interview things. Obviously not as many for tech interviews, which is why we're having this seminar, but otherwise in terms like interviewing in general, doing just some resume editing or touch-ups, things like that. They have some really great resources, so definitely look at those. And then obviously on Crimson Careers, there are a lot of job and internship postings. Also, there are a lot of info sessions that companies hold. If you're interested in a company, but maybe not necessarily the things that they have posted on either their website or on Crimson Careers, do feel free to go to the info sessions and ask them about other opportunities, because sometimes they might have an opportunity where you could, say, intern with a team that is normally not hiring interns or something like that. So also other things to think about.
Okay.
So just talking a little bit about the typical roles. We'll go in a little more detail about each of these, but basically you have the program manager, the software developer, the software tester, and UX, where they basically design user interface and user interaction, and it's more about kind of the experience that the user has with the product itself. So to go in a little more in depth in some of the other ones. So program manager focuses on the customer, and basically they will design features and or products and basically manage the entire process. So they'll manage things like timeline, what features will get added or cut depending on their priority and basically the time that they have. They're going to work with their developers to basically make sure that what they're envisioning for this product gets carried out. And they're also going to basically fine-tune features based on what customers might want and not want, and what things are working well and what things might not be working as well. So it's definitely more high-level, kind of customer-oriented, thinking about how the user is interacting with this product and just kind of managing the whole project as a whole.
All right. And then there are the devs. So the software developers, or software engineers as they're referred to at some other companies, are the guys who actually produce the code. These are the guys who are implementing the features that the PMs are providing high-level guidance on whether or not they should be included, whereas the PM makes the design decision saying, okay, this needs to be included, this needs to be prioritized over this. The PM then goes to the software developer and says, hey, put this together for me. And the software dev is the guy who sits down at his workstation, usually a pretty sick multi-monitor setup, maybe a nice mechanical hacker keyboard. He's tapping away and making the magic happen behind the scenes. So if you're interested in being a hacker, working at the low level, or maybe working at a higher level, if you want to go to some sort of web startup or company like Google or Facebook, where they're working on a web platform as opposed to low-level code working in an operating system, which you might find at Microsoft, for example, then you're likely going to want to entertain the idea of being a software developer, checking out a software developer internship. And just to summarize these bullet points here, so the software dev obviously is the guy who's writing the code. He's also developing the features which are envisioned by the product team, the managers who are coming in and say, hey, our customers need this, this, and this, and also doing unit testing to make sure that his code or her code passes some metric of quality before passing it off. And where does he or she pass it off? Well, to the software tester. So a software tester is sort of this often unsung position that you may not have heard as much about as you have about software developers or software engineers or even program managers. Software testers are essential to the process, however, when you're generating production code, which is going out to a large number of customers, because the software testers are the ones who actually find the bugs and handle the performance and stress testing of dev code. It's very easy when you're just writing code to get to a certain point and think that it seems to be working, and that of course your logic is all very sound and this is a very good program. But when you're deploying in a large number of systems, which will often be the case if you go on to work in a big tech company or even a startup which is finding itself getting a lot of popularity on the internet, then you're going to be working on a lot of machines, and the probability of finding some error manifesting on users' actual deployments, even if the probability of the bug manifesting in an individual machine is low, becomes very high. So it's very important to be running these sorts of tests, and the software tester is essential in this process. It's good to apply for a test position if you're interested in poking holes in other people's code and trying to break things. It's a really fun position. I know some people who have been involved with it, and you really get to put other people's code through the ringer and think about low-level problems as well as high-level issues people might be having with code.
So a little bit more about the relationship between dev and test. Basically, when a test will find bugs, they're going to tell the devs that there are these bugs, but they also need to be able to come up with a potential solution, or at least pinpoint why this bug is happening. So it's really good if you're good at analyzing code, good at breaking code, and good at kind of figuring out where all of these edge cases are. So if you have a hacker mindset, then test is definitely for you. So a little bit about resumes. You definitely want to tailor your resume for the job or internship that you're applying for. So if you're, say for example, applying for a company where you want to be a developer, then some of your extracurriculars or some of your interests that are not quite as, not necessarily suited, but that don't quite highlight all of your skills and capabilities as a developer, you might want to, either move them lower down in your resume or, summarize them in a shorter, more brief, just line or two. You want to make sure your resume really highlights you for the position that you're applying for. And also, don't exaggerate. Be prepared to demonstrate anything that you're saying. So if you say, I'm a hacker in Perl, and they ask you to, write something, or they ask you a question specific to that, you should be prepared to, prove that you are as competent as you say you are. Often it's nice to sort of, boost your resume a little bit and say, I have lots of experience in all these languages because I've taken classes in all of them. But if you did OCaml 3 years ago and you haven't seen it since, it's probably not good to say you're very, very good at it, because if they call you out on it, then it's not going to look very good during your interview when you basically blank and have to admit that you don't remember anything. Definitely include relevant experiences and roles that are pertain to the job you're applying to. So if you're applying for a web development job and you've worked on many web projects, maybe you were webmaster for a lot of groups, those are definitely good things to include, because most likely they're going to look through your resume at the beginning, kind of glance through it, ask you about certain things on it. So it'd be great if you could talk about things that are basically going to highlight the skills that are going to make you a great candidate for this job you're applying for. And also note your contribution. So, if you were on, say, a 20-person team and you were basically just there as one of the 20 people, then it's probably not good to say, oh, I led a team of 20 people doing this, because then when they ask you, you're going to end up not being able to answer. But on the contrary, if you were, say, leading a group, or you're the president of something, or you headed a startup, definitely do use those keywords, because it demonstrates kind of your contribution to this product, and they will probably ask you more specific things about it if you were, say, had a much bigger role. And also, the last one, as I mentioned, definitely only include languages you know. You never know, even if it's an obscure language, when your interviewer might also happen to be a genius at this obscure language and ask you, how you like the syntax of this language. And when you can't answer, it's definitely not a good way to start off your interview.
It's certainly okay to only have a few languages on your resume that you're very familiar with. If you're coming out of CS50, you might feel like, oh, I can put down C, PHP, and JavaScript, and some HTML stuff and SQL stuff. But, that's only CS50 stuff. Maybe I should have more on here. I'm not going to stand out, look very impressive. But if you think about it, C, PHP, JavaScript, maybe you did some Python stuff in your final project or something, and you have some experience with that. It's actually starting to sound relatively impressive. And when you go into these companies, at least, you'll probably be using some of those basic languages fairly frequently. And if you're interested in going somewhere like Google, where they use Java a lot, you may find that it's relatively easy for you to pick up some Java after you've learned some C. So if you're a little self-conscious about having a small number of languages, maybe just try exploring some others and see if you can gain some relative familiarity, and just mention that you have some basic level familiarity with things like Java, for example, if you just toyed around with it. Although, certainly, to emphasize this again, don't overrepresent any familiarity you might have, because it can come back to bite you more so than not including that at all. And also, just to highlight one other thing, just to avoid giving the wrong impression. So we do say tailor your resume to the job or internship you're looking for. So perhaps adjust the ordering of things, include some things over others if they seem like they're more relevant to the task the task you'd be likely to do at the job. But this doesn't mean that you necessarily have to present yourself as solely a technical person. As someone coming from Harvard, obviously most of the people at this school have a large variety of interests, and we track the student body, which may not just be interested in technical things, but be interested in other things as well. For example, I've applied to for internships and full-time jobs exclusively for technical positions, but that doesn't mean I ever took any of the non-technical things like Model UN that I've done throughout college off my resume. You can still represent important parts of your personality that are relevant in a job setting, even if they're not directly involved with coding or working on some large group project. So make sure you're thinking not about how technical it makes you look, but how attractive of a candidate it makes you look in a technical position, which is a fine distinction. Okay, so now we move on to discussing the tech interview. And most of us probably wouldn't think of IKEA as a tech company, but there are perhaps some lessons to be learned from this little comic. So we see someone coming in for a job interview with IKEA, and this guy seems a little surprised because he just didn't expect that he'd have to assemble his seat in the interview room. And what is the manager thinking? Well, honestly, this is probably just a pretty contrived exercise, but it may seem to you sometimes that in your tech interviews you're doing pretty contrived exercises. The point of this interview is that the manager wants to, or the recruiter, or whoever this guy is, wants to make sure that this applicant is familiar with the product and at least has some base level knowledge of what he's going to be working with, in addition to being a good job applicant for whatever type of position he's looking for. So regardless of whether you're looking at a program management position, whether you're looking at a more technical, like a dev position or something like that, you're going to be expected to have knowledge of low-level technical stuff like how to code, basic knowledge about computer science, and you're also going to be expected to have knowledge of the company and its product. So if you're applying to Microsoft, they expect you know a little something about Windows and maybe Microsoft Office. If you're applying to Google, you probably should have done a Google search sometime in the last few months. Okay, so what does the interview process look like? So first you'll have a first round interview, obviously. It's usually about an hour long, sometime a little shorter. The purpose of the first round interview varies somewhat from company to company. Facebook structures their first round interview much like they structure their second round interview, which happens immediately afterward before they fly you out. So you may find in the first round interview, if you're applying for an engineering position at Facebook, for example, that they'll be asking you technical questions right off the bat. Whereas Microsoft, depending on the candidate's previous experience and the position they're looking at, may have a personality or fit interview first and just ask you questions about your interest in the company and things you've done before flying you out and having your second round interviews in Redmond. So it does vary by company, but it's generally a bit less intense and just a way to feel you out as a candidate before they really put you through the ringer in the next stages. Generally, final round interviews, the structure does change somewhat based on company. As I said, Facebook has essentially what you consider as 2 first round interviews before they send you off to the final round. But the structure generally tends to be some preliminary basic first round interviews followed by a more advanced round where they might fly you out somewhere and are asking you harder questions at greater length. These final round interviews, there's usually about 3 to 5 of them. They'll typically last from 30 to 60 minutes each, and you'll be asked generally 1 or 2 technical question in each one. The structure tends to be pretty much like this, actually. You'll be brought into the room with the interviewer. You'll have a little small talk, introduce yourself to each other. He or she might tell you a little bit about what they've worked on at the company, how long they've been there. It'll typically actually be pretty interesting, so make sure you're engaged and listening to them and not just worrying about what the questions are going to be coming up. They'll ask you a little bit about things on your resume, some experiences you've had. They're like, "Oh, I see you did this at Harvard. What was that like? What sort of things what other things related to that have you done? What is that? That sounds cool." They'll ask you about your prior experience, like, "Oh, what sort of technical projects have you worked on? Oh, that's interesting. Why'd you do that? Who are you working with on that? Oh, I know that person. He's really cool." And then you'll transition into the more substantive portion of the interview where you'll be asked either 1 long problem or 2 smaller ones. Generally some kind of technical or coding question, or if it's a PM position, something more product-oriented. We'll talk more about what these questions look like on the following slides. And after the substantive portion, the interviewer will generally give you an opportunity to ask questions. The attitude toward the what you're expected of for questions at the end of the interview, I think varies from company to company. There doesn't tend to be a lot of pressure in technical interviews to ask a lot of insightful questions. I don't think it's really evaluative in the sense that I think it is with some consulting or finance companies. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely more a matter of like, you probably shouldn't be asking things like, so what exactly is this internship? Things like that, because they're going to expect that you'll have done your research about what, you were actually applying for. But, things like, oh, what's a typical intern day, look like? Or what kind of projects might I be working on? Or what have you enjoyed the most about working at this company? Things like that, where you can kind of engage in the conversation, find out a little more about the company, and also kind of show some interest in not just, I just want to be hired, but more about maybe the work environment at the company or the social life or just kind of the company atmosphere and maybe, what they like or maybe even don't like about the company. It's definitely not something that you're really evaluated on. Unless, it just demonstrates that you don't know anything about the company, in which case that will probably count against you. But otherwise, it's kind of more for you to ask questions that you genuinely are curious about.
You can sort of think of this component as the interview as if you remember when you were applying to Harvard and other schools, they'd have you meet up with an alum or something and have an in-person interview. And the way they describe it is like, oh, this can only help you, which is like, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But you should think of this portion as an opportunity to maybe shine a little more and seem like an engaging, interesting, insightful person who has a lot of passion for the company. And it also allows you to benefit from the experience of the person you're interacting with, because how often do you get to talk to someone who's like, I don't know, maybe been at Google for 12 years and has been working in Google Plus for the last year and a half or something like that. like that. That's pretty cool to have the opportunity to just ask those questions and gain a little insight into what the processes are like at these companies and what sort of things you might get to experience if you end up following up on an offer with one of these companies. One of the Facebook recruiters told me recently, and I just thought this is really funny, is she told us that Facebook just doesn't care if you want to ask questions or not. They're not going to evaluate based on it. And the way she put it was like, if you finish answering questions and they say, hey, do you have any questions for us? If you don't, you can just say, nope, drop the mic and leave, is the way she put it, which, like, you know, if you're a superstar coder and you just can't be bothered, I guess is the attitude you'd take. You generally don't want to take that tack, I think. I think there is value in showing some interest and being engaged with your interviewer and taking an interest in what they do. But keep in mind that it's not a deal breaker if you find yourself worrying, like, oh God, did I think of a good enough question? It's not such a big thing. Okay, some core technical knowledge. So these are interview questions are going to typically fall into similar classes of problems, and these classes of problems are going to exploit particular aspects of your technical knowledge and familiarity with basic computer science and programming concepts. Good things to know. Language syntax. You should know at least one language well going in, preferably an imperative language. I've heard a lot of horror stories of people taking CS50 and then taking CS51, and you learn OCaml, and you kind of forget all about C, and you're really good at functional languages all of a sudden, but you're not very good at imperative languages, and you've forgotten everything. You don't even know how to like declare an int anymore. And you go into your program, your technical interview, and they're like, hey, implement this. And you're like, oh, that's really simple. I know exactly how to do that. And you're like, I'm going to do it in OCaml. And suddenly it becomes very hard. Because OCaml is great because as John Gregg often tells us, if it compiles, it probably works, but you don't have a compiler, so it probably won't. So brush up on your imperative languages. Look over C. If you like Python, higher level languages, by all means, look over Python. It's just like pseudocode anyway, so it's great to use in an interview. Java is also fine. Just know something well going in so that you're not just pseudocoding on the board and making a bunch of embarrassing syntax errors. It's not a big deal, and just like coding a little bit before you go into your interview will really open the floodgates and everything will come back to you. It's like riding a bike. It really is. And
a note on that, do also note that like different companies will have certain, not necessarily preferences, but they would like to see certain languages. So for example, Google works a lot with object-oriented programming, so they'd prefer to see something more like Java or JavaScript over C, though like they wouldn't mind either. But like if you're equally comfortable in say an object-oriented and non-object-oriented, do think about the company and maybe which one will demonstrate sort of your strengths more.
Yeah, very good point. Linked lists. I cannot emphasize linked lists enough. Linked list, linked list, linked list. Doubly linked, singly linked, any kind of linked list, you want it. So you're going to see a lot of questions where and we'll have an example of one coming up, but just doing tricky things with a linked list, like things you never would have thought of doing with a linked list, things that it doesn't seem like you should do with a linked list. But they're going to want you to, and in that context, you really should. So you can Google all sorts of questions like this, or Bing all sorts of questions like this. How to insert something into a linked list, how to remove something from a linked list, how to reverse a linked list, how to determine something about a linked list. But really know how to work with these structures and know how to handle pointers if you want to do it in C, or just how to handle it as an object if you want to work in Java or C++ or something like this. But this is really key. And we'll do a question with that soon so you can see an example of what that's like. But just hold that in your head. Other common data structures like sets, hash maps, trees, and graphs. If these don't seem too familiar to you right now, just look them up on Wikipedia or something like that. Get some basic familiarity with what these structures look like. You won't always even have to work with these in a coding context, like writing up code that interacts with a tree or graph. But you may have to represent components of a problem in the form of a tree or a graph. And once you understand the basic concepts, it becomes easier to think with them and work with them. If you haven't taken CS51 yet, very good idea to take that course to get some familiarity with trees and graphs. Something that's touched on more in that class than in CS50 if you're taking that now. CS124 is also, although an intimidating class, a good option to get exposure to a lot of different types of algorithms, which will prepare you for thinking about more sophisticated problems, though not necessarily a prerequisite for performing well in a technical interview. Recursion. A lot of problems can be solved very naturally recursively, and a lot of problems can be solved a lot more simply using recursion. So being able to express that and recognize that in an interview is very key. Object-oriented programming, if you're not someone who likes to program in object-oriented languages all the time. I'm kind of a C guy myself, but I can delve into C++ if I need to. you definitely want to at least be familiar. You want to know how to create a class, how to implement a class, how to make what an object is, how that's distinct from a class, and just know how to program using that paradigm, because once again, especially companies like Google care a lot about that, and you want to make sure you're showing that you're a well-rounded programmer if you're going for a technical position, and that you're able to handle working in this sort of environment. And also knowing how to think about in terms of time and space complexity and using asymptotic notation. You may be more familiar with thinking about time complexity using asymptotic notation. So what does this run in? Oh, big O of n squared, of course. O of n log n, O of n, or O of log n if it's really efficient. Good to be able to recognize how fast an algorithm you propose runs and how to think in terms of big O notation. Space complexity is also something that's important, and that just means how much memory is this algorithm going to use. If you use a recursive algorithm, recognize that every time you call it, you're taking up more space on the stack. So however long it takes to run is probably going to be very similar to how much space it takes up as well. They may ask you, okay, do something non-recursive. Show me something that works in constant space, and that would just mean always uses the same amount of memory no matter how large the input is. So it's just like time complexity, but you're thinking of how much memory you're using instead. So very similar idea. If you understand one, you do necessarily really understand the other, but just get used to thinking in terms of both when you're looking at problems.
Yeah, and definitely know that it's not necessarily that you should be able to spit out, the best running time for a merge sort or something like that, but rather that after you present your solution, they will most likely ask you, how fast does this run? Can you do better? And if so, do it. And when that happens, you should be able to, look at your code and say, okay, I think this runs in n squared, but I think I can do it in n. Or, I think this runs in n, and I don't think we can make it any faster, and here's why. So understanding more why it's in certain run times, and not necessarily just memorizing, certain specific ones for searches or sorts or things like that.
Great.
So getting ready, you should definitely brush up on at least one language that you're comfortable with. Maybe look over some old P sets, do some just simple practice problems, reverse a singly linked list, anything to really just brush up on key things like that. Review data structures, right? Because there are certain methods that are maybe native to Java that are not there in C. So you don't want to be, calling something .size in C when in the interview you realize, oh, I don't think this actually exists. So rather than trying to spread your, time prepping for multiple, it's usually sufficient to mostly prep for one so that you're very comfortable in it, and then just brush up on the other ones. Practice sample questions. It's definitely good to get warmed up, and it's more so for yourself to know that you can do it. And that's definitely a big part in doing these interviews, is that once you know that you have the knowledge to do it, then you're a lot more calm and a lot less likely to, be rushed into programming something that runs in, exponential time. Other resources, if you guys are curious, so How Would You Move Mount Fuji is a great book on problem solving and kind of more the PM type questions, though there are questions that are mostly not used anymore, but the thought process that goes into them, it's definitely a great read. Programming Interviews Exposed is also another great one. It walks through some common structures that are tested, such as graphs and linked lists, and also goes through a lot of sample problems. So if you're looking for something to kind of brush up on your knowledge and then look into new ways to approach these problems, that's a great book too. Programming Pearls, I haven't read, but I've had other people recommend it to me, similar to Programming Interviews Exposed, where it's a lot more about, the more technical coding kind of questions. But you'll definitely see a lot of examples in these books if you're at all interested or are more the reading type for. Another thing is you definitely want to work out loud. When you're interviewing, most likely they will give you a whiteboard and a marker, and kind of that's your workspace. The worst thing you can do is kind of turn your back on the interviewer and just start writing, because one, the interviewer probably can't see and probably has no idea what you're doing, and two, they don't really know what you're thinking. So, if initially you misunderstood their problem, or you're taking an approach that's going to take you all of 45 minutes to write or something like that, they'll have no idea, and all they can really do is sit there and watch you code. Instead, think about it almost like you guys are working together on this problem. So, once they present the problem, you clarify what you're thinking, maybe walk through an example with them to make sure that your understanding of the problem is correct. and then just start talking. Say, well, I think with this problem we want to code some for loop like this, and then call this other function. Things like that to give an overview, and usually they will, nod in confirmation, or if you're going in a wrong direction, at this point they'll most likely point this out to you and say something along the lines of, are we sure we want to do that, or does this really cover the case when this happens? And usually you can prevent problems earlier on than if you just start coding right away. And you also have the advantage of, seeing their reactions, and if they're kind of giving you a quizzical look, sometimes maybe it's time for you to step back and look at what you're doing and maybe reevaluate if your recursive function calling another recursive function is really the best way to go. And also, it's great for just showing them the way you think. So even if your solution ends up not being completely correct, maybe you forget to check one last node, or you forget some edge case. But the thought process you go about, solving this problem is really key to them, because they can see that you're analytical, and even if your syntax is not completely correct, they know that this is stuff that, if you were on the job, you could just look up. And so it's more about the thought that goes into it and sort of the pseudocoding mindset that you have.
And the major takeaway is that you don't need to start out at the correct solution. It can be a process by which you start out with some very basic solution or thoughts which might lead to a basic solution, which then allow you to come to a more optimal solution with prompting. Melissa had said previously, you can suggest like some way to do something in n squared time, for example, and then you end up in linear time later with some prompting to tell you that it is possible and what you might want to think about, and that's okay. It's very important to be able to at least demonstrate that you're able to identify that there is some naive and efficient approach in how you would implement it correctly, and then move on to making it more optimal, more efficient. If you realize there's an n squared solution, but you want to come up with an n solution, you shouldn't sit there and say, oh, hold on, let me think about this. I'm trying to come up with an idea. Hang on. Okay. Okay, what if we did this? No, you want to say, okay, well, we could approach this just very naively, saying we want to take an n squared solution. We could do this and this and this. This doesn't seem very efficient. It seems like there's some way we could perhaps make this go linear by just doing pairwise comparison. Just throw out words like that. If that apply, no, don't just throw out words. Don't just throw out words like I just did. Throwing out buzzwords is never going to work for you. Bluffing is never going to work for you. You want to be throwing out words that are actually applicable, showing what you're thinking about, what sort of solutions you're identifying here, demonstrating what you're thinking about at the time to illustrate your thought process for them. And then based on what you're saying and what they know you're thinking, they'll be able to guide you toward a solution with you working together. And that's the end goal, to arrive at a correct solution, an efficient solution, rather than just come up with one immediately or come up with one without any help at all. These problems are generally designed so there's a very obvious, easy solution, but a more complex, efficient solution which you need to find together. And that's the way you want to approach these, as sort of a process moving toward a solution where what you're providing for your interviewer is not the answer to the question, but rather an opportunity to evaluate how you reach it. The journey is more important than the destination, as it were.
Also, if you've seen a question before, it's usually good to tell your interviewer that you have. Usually they've been interviewing long enough to be able to tell when you miraculously arrive at the most optimal solution in 30 seconds and code it flawlessly. And usually they'll suspect that you've seen it before and not be very impressed with your ability to memorize or, recall old code, versus if you were to tell them, they might actually, be impressed that you are challenging yourself, and they will probably present you with a different problem, or they might ask you to continue with this problem. Also, if you're working through your solution and halfway through you realize that there's a better way to do this, it's probably good to finish your solution first so that you at least arrive at a complete solution, rather than saying, oh, let's scratch this, erase everything, and start over. Because if your new solution is, you can't finish it, or it's not actually correct, then you end up with a blank board and, no demonstration of any skill whatsoever.
Right. Right, good. So, and to emphasize this once again, since this is a process where you're working with the interviewer to arrive at a solution, if you have to ask, you should always feel free to ask clarifying questions. Oftentimes, they'll give you a certain set of information for defining what the problem is they want you to solve, but it won't be enough information to really come up with an adequate solution. Maybe there's some detail missing that when you're implementing manifests as a problem because, if you're looking for perhaps an approximation of some value and you don't know how close the approximation has to be, you should ask, okay, can we assume we want to get within some value epsilon, for example? And they'll say, oh yeah, sure, you can make that assumption. Or you might say, oh, are we assuming we're always taking in integers and not floating point values? They'll say, okay, yeah, you can make that assumption. These are things they want you to ask, and the reason they don't tell you immediately is because they want to see that you recognize that it's an issue, that we don't know this, that this is ambiguous, and they want to know that you're able to define a problem appropriately. So you should always be working through your thought process out loud. If you realize something looks like it's a problem, you should bring that up and say it is. And they might say, okay, yeah, I see that that's a problem. Or they might surprise you and say something like, is it though? And then you'll start questioning yourself and you'll have an idea. It's sort of an implicit hint. You didn't have to ask for a hint. They were just willing to give you that guidance and prompting you in a certain direction. So you get a lot of benefit from working out loud like that. And also you benefit in that your interviewer gets a better sense of who you are and how you work. It also shows that you're willing to reach out to other people for help when you're having trouble solving a problem, which is generally good in a collaborative environment where we're trying to produce something, which is the case in a tech company. Ask for hints if you need one. Try to avoid that if you can. If you think you can work it out without asking for an explicit hint, of course you should. I won't lie to you, it's always going to look better. But it's much better to ask for the hint when you need one than not be able to find a solution to the problem. And it's not necessarily going to reflect on you all that poorly. And you might still be perceived as having had a really good interview if you have to ask for a hint. So that resource is there for you. And I've asked for hints in interviews before. I think most of the people I've talked to before who had interviews have asked for a hint at some point. Sometimes you just can't see what the solution to the problem should be. Sometimes it's because the problem was too vague and you're thinking about it in a different way. Sometimes it's because you just have a mental block and you're not seeing it. And that happens. It happens to everyone who codes. Like, don't feel like you can't ask for that because you should if you need it. And like as I said before, if you don't know, don't pretend you know. If you think a solution works, but you're not really sure, you can't really do what you do in math where you say oh, this is trivial, so we don't show it. That's not okay because they might ask you to actually write the code, and you can't say, oh, we assume we have a function that does this, because they're going to say, okay, for now, sure. And then when we get done, they'll say, all right, now write that function. And it's oh no. Not trivial at all. But so yeah, bluffing doesn't work. If you don't know, ask for a hint, ask for a clarification, because they will find out. The problems are small enough that they're able to analyze everything you say, but complex enough that it might be non-trivial and you may run into issues. And above all, don't panic. It doesn't help you to panic. It's really going to be okay. Even if you feel like something's going badly, it might not necessarily be going badly. Many of the people in this room probably have very high standards for themselves and get stressed out under pressure. That's just something that comes with the territory here. And just because you feel like something's going badly doesn't necessarily mean it is, and panicking doesn't help salvage the situation if you want to think about it in terms of that, by just staying focused and moving forward with the problem and showing that you can work under pressure even when you're a bit confused by some aspects of the problem. That's the best thing you can do for yourself, and it's going to benefit you the most by not panicking. Always good advice.
And that's definitely important for, especially important for PM interviews, because the entire process is about sort of designing what the customer wants, right? And usually they'll give you a very vague, very general prompt, like design an elevator. Well, before jumping right into it, you should probably ask clarifying questions like, what is this for? Who's going to be using it? How many floors does it have? If it's a one-story building, you probably don't need an elevator. Just things like that. Even if they seem like silly questions like that, asking them will show your interviewer that you're at least thinking about it analytically and that you're considering what the user wants and kind of honing in on the features you want to design for your elevator or whatever, things like that. So.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Okay, so types of interview questions.
Okay, so there are three general types of interview questions. There are coding questions, which basically are, just kind of things that you would see as a subset of a problem set, given a linked list, reverse it, and then you would ask questions, singly link, doubly link, things like that, and eventually they're going to ask, okay, code this function, or write pseudocode for it, or how would you implement this. Product questions are more like designing questions. They'll have you design usually not necessarily code-based things. They might be everyday things that you use or special cases of everyday objects that you use. And you need to sort of analytically think about what the customer might want, what the customer definitely wants, and what would be good to have for the customer, given that we had enough time and enough budget. logic or problem-solving questions. These are often, things that you would imagine seeing from middle school or high school, where it's, figure out if we can say that every year it has to have a Friday the 14th. Things like that, where it's not necessarily writing code for it, but it's definitely the same sort of logic process where you would go through some method to, figure out, is this true? Is it false? How do we prove it? How do we show a counterexample? Obviously not proof as you would see in like math class or anything like that, but definitely just more thinking through it and just showing that you're good at problem solving and finding some sort of solution given some random problem that they're going to present you.
And a particular class of problems that actually might fall under like the vague title of problem solving questions are problems where you have to approximate something by considering a bunch of components that go into it, and you eventually want to get to some value within some order of magnitude. For example, they might ask you, how much bandwidth do you think YouTube uses in a month? Or the much less interesting question, how many golf balls do you think you can fit in a bus? And you think about, okay, so how big is a golf ball? Is like an inch in diameter or something like that? I don't know if that's right, but it's on the order of an inch in diameter, right? And if I want to just think about the golf ball as being like much like a cube of where each side is of length 1. That's not quite right, but it's somewhat of an approximation. If I remember geometry very well, or spatial geometry, I can think about what the formula actually is and figure out the volume of the golf ball, and then I can think about, okay, like a school bus is about 20 or 30 feet long. So that's probably wrong, whatever. And it's about 10 feet wide. That's probably also wrong, but it's on the order of those things. And maybe I would like refine those numbers somewhat if I were thinking harder about it. And then I do some math and say, okay, you can fit like about N golf balls or somewhere within that. And that's the sort of problem you might be thinking about. So the point of those is basically to just like, how well you would analyze a problem and think about the components of it, and how well are you able to like come up with approximations of the resources you need on the fly. And so that's one thing to be prepared for. I haven't personally seen those very often, but they can come up in more product-y type of interviews.
I'm sure.
Okay, so let's look at some actual questions. We won't dwell overly long on this because the purpose of this is to give you more of a general idea of what the application process is like. And Tony will actually be hosting a seminar on acing your technical interviews, where I imagine he'll be talking about these issues a little more in depth, and we'll plug that near the end, and you can sign up online to go to that if you'd like. But just to give you an idea of what sort of questions you might be given. So linked lists. Given a linked list, determine whether it contains a cycle. And we're obviously not going to give you this picture of a linked list, because I bet all of you could tell me right now whether or not this linked list contains a cycle. The idea is you're going to be handed, let's say we're working in C where we're dealing with pointers, you're handed a pointer to the first element in the linked list, or maybe you're given a reference to the first node within a linked list, and all these nodes are connected to each other. So how do you determine whether or not it contains a cycle? Anyone have any initial ideas?
What about first instincts? Anyone, just shout.
Sure.
Maybe you make a second linked list that involves both pointers to each other and like some kind of marker with the original address or pointer of the first one, and you somehow like check it against itself for overlapping. Not sure that logically makes sense, but.
Okay, so we have an idea of having an additional list where we're keeping
So basically
track of
storing each one that we've been to so far and checking it
some kind
each
of
time.
iteration with like string compare.
Okay, so the idea is essentially we remember each one we've looked at so far, and every time we see a new one, we compare it to one we've looked at already. So if we number these starting at 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, if after we get back to 2 again, we see we've already been to 2 because we remember its memory address or something else that identifies it. Okay, so how much space does that take up? Yeah, it takes up n space. So it takes up linear space because we end up having to store some information for every element within our linked list. So if this ends up being a linked list of size 1 billion, okay, so we can do it. It's going to take up a lot of memory because we have to remember a lot of things. I propose we can do this in constant space. Any ideas? Back here?
If there's never a null pointer.
Okay, so think about, so how do you know there's never a null pointer, though? If you just keep going through the linked list and going to the next one and the next one and the next one, you keep going in a circle forever, and you don't actually know if you are seeing new things, and it's just really long. You're like, wow, this is such a long linked list. So that actually works in the case where where it does end and it doesn't contain a cycle, so you can determine that it does not contain a cycle. But if you're trying to determine if it does contain a cycle, and anyone who's taking CS 121 should be perking up right now, because this is following this algorithm, it recognizes lists that don't contain a cycle, but it doesn't decide lists that do contain a cycle. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. It's mostly useless. But no, it has applications for situations like this, obviously. So it's easy to make fun of theoretical CS, but it's compelling, and you should all take CS 121. This is on camera. Okay, so any ideas about what we can do here?
Yes.
You could have 2 pointers and have one run faster than the other and see if they ever line up.
Interesting. So that's a good thing to think about. And so the idea was we could have 2 pointers which iterate through the linked list at different rates, and if they ever intersect, the argument is that one has gone all the way around and caught up with the other, and this means there must be a cycle, else they never would have met again. That seems to be the right idea. We won't go in depth as to why that's correct or how that can be implemented, but that's something maybe you should all consider thinking about in solving this problem if it's not immediately obvious why it works. So yeah, 2 pointers moving at different rates. Interesting way of approaching this problem, likely correct. So,
Usually if you see a linked list, you probably want at least 2 pointers, just FYI. I started constructing a problem with just 1 pointer, realized very soon that I needed 3, and then had to backtrack, so bad news. So yeah, definitely for linked lists, you usually want at least 2 pointers, just because if it's singly linked. But.
Okay. Another question. Given a positive real number, find the square root. And you're not allowed to just include math.h and call square root, so no cheating. So what do you do here? Finding the square root seems hard.
What's your first instinct?
A lot of iteration, or like a while of guess and check, where you just keep getting closer to approximating it with squaring it.
Right, because we can definitely start a while loop, right, with some I or something like that. So the suggestion was that we basically have some iteration that keeps going, and it's a guess and check process. So we would guess some y and square it and basically see if that equals x. If not, keep going until we've surpassed it, and then we can backtrack or
a decimal point.
Right, we can kind of approximate or go in further.
How do you know when you're done?
You have to. I guess instead of saying they have to equal, instead you're saying you could always test the difference between them, and as long as the difference is small enough, you could say you got close enough. Because you can never.
Okay. So the idea is if we're within some distance of the right answer, then we can say that's good enough. But does the question say that's okay?
You should ask
The question doesn't say that's okay, so maybe you should ask your interviewer if that seems like a reasonable assumption to make, since if the number you're trying to find the square root of is 2, you might be there for a while.
Yes.
Yeah.
You could do the Taylor expansion.
You could do the Taylor expansion. The suggestion was you could do the Taylor expansion, and the way I would push that back on that is you can do the Taylor expansion if you really want to. But yeah, that's something you could potentially come out with. That's not the way. This is actually an interview question that I had seen before. All these actually came from interviews we had seen previously or had heard from others. So these are real situations. That is a novel approach, which is that's not what I thought of. The previous suggestion was to take a guess and then try something else and see which one is closer, and then maybe look at something in between. What is that starting to sound like? It's starting to sound like binary search, but we don't really have a sorted list of possible answers, do we? Well, what is our list of possible answers?
Numbers.
Our sorted list of possible answers is the real numbers. Interesting. Binary search on the reals. We leave this as an exercise to the audience. And now we'll move on to some product-y questions with Melissa.
So this might be a typical product question that you might see. So they might say, design for me a remote control for a television with 2 buttons. So obviously your first approach would be kind of defining, what you want. So let's say, you've already assumed that, it has to have 2 buttons. No, you can't have a touch screen. And, it has to have all the same functionalities. So how might you, decide this implementation? You're a PM, you don't count. Yes.
I guess you want to determine like who the audience is and like whether it's a special type of TV or just like a regular TV if there are any like special considerations.
Right. Okay. So let's say that we want to decide,
what was
what
the
kind of
question?
audience.
Or
The
what
question
was the
was
suggestion?
that we want to ask about the audience and also what type of TV it is. And so let's say we determine that everything is normal. It should behave just like a normal remote with 25 buttons or however many it is. Yes.
You'd want to, as simply as possible, figure out like creative ways of using the buttons, like a double click and a triple click, or hitting them together in different ways to make the most important functions come out. And I mean, you can do that a different number of times to make all the functionality, but you probably have to like pick and choose what you think your priorities are.
Right. So the suggestion was basically that with the two buttons, with combinations of buttons, double clicks, triple clicks, both buttons at the same time, we can basically get a different configuration or at least a different combination of the number of sequences we can have and basically assign things to that. Yes.
This sounds like, I don't think this is a very good method, but you could have one button recognize, like, say if you just click it and leave it for like a certain amount of time and leave it double click, and that could represent a 1 and a 0. Oh, just a single click versus a double click. And then you'd have to have some sort of table that recognizes, all right, if you just input a 0, and then the other one would be like, okay, I've ended my number. So a 0 would be some function, 1 would be some other function, etc.
So my first answer to this question when the idea was so you hold down one button and then you're able to input sort of a code based
Right.
on
Basically binary with one button. The other one is to submit that you've ended the binary. So interesting enough, when I presented this problem first to Matt, that was his implementation as well. And the first thing I told him was, you're thinking like a dev. Because essentially he was thinking, how am I going to code this? But if you think about it from a user's perspective, they probably don't want a 3-page chart of all the binary values and what they actually relate to for the buttons because, oh no, we've screwed up, now how do we clear? And I have no idea like if I've double clicked or single clicked, so obviously not something very user friendly, but definitely things to maybe bring up and then discard as possible implementations. We won't really go too much more into detail about actual implementations, but one thing to note is that usually with design questions, they'll probably ask you follow-ups where they'll change the parameters or something like that. So in this case, the follow-up question might be, okay, so that's a great two-button remote control. So now let's say we only have one button. Now implement that. So definitely be prepared for things like that and be prepared to sort of think on the fly about how you can modify your implementation and your design.
So both to defend myself and also drive Melissa's point home, I will still maintain that my solution minimizes the number of clicks the user has to input because you can apply Huffman encoding and do a frequency analysis of the most common functions to minimize the number of button clicks each person has to enter every time they want their TV to do something. That being the case, Grandma doesn't know how to do that, so she can't use the TV, and that's unfortunate, and that's not the demographic we're looking at. So yeah, when you're answering these questions, you don't want to think like a Dev or a Matt. You want to think like a Melissa, and you want to approach the problem and think what is most intuitive for people who are going to use this, and maybe you can talk about like, oh, if we use Huffman encoding, we can do this, but it's not intuitive, and like just show off a little that you like know what you're talking about with that, but say, okay, that's not a good solution, and then move toward things that are easier to use for regular people that use things.
Julia wants to say something.
I just wanted to say you can also use them for user feedback. So if you ask the interviewee, say like, oh yeah, I would conduct a survey to see what are the most common functions of the remote, and you could say, okay, so I conducted this survey, and I'm going to assume these are the common functions, or you can ask them and say, can you tell me like what the user feedback was?
Right, that's a great point. So Julia suggested that with this, you can also basically use the interviewer as a source for feedback and also basically say that they are the audience and propose that you might survey, X number of people because that is something that PMs are likely to do to basically get consumer feedback. And then, kind of have that interviewer simulate that and give you feedback on, what they might want or what buttons they might find the most useful or what features, things like that. So definitely keep an open conversation.
Shall we?
Yeah. So the second one that you'll probably see a lot is something like, what's your favorite product we make? What do you like about it? This is not necessarily meant to be a test of, do you know every single product this company makes? but more so that you have some understanding of, the kind of products the company does make, but more so that you can kind of think about their products in a way that a consumer might, because they'll likely ask you, okay, what features do you like about it? What do you think we can improve on? Or maybe even if you were redesigning this, how might you do things differently? So it doesn't really matter, to them if you were to say their most popular item that everyone knows about, or if you were to mention, some very obscure one that only you and 3 other people have used. As long as you can sort of defend your answer and think analytically about it and what you might do to improve it, or what you don't like about it, what you like about it, that's all there is really to it.
So what do you guys think of this product? This is a circular saw which is used to cut your pizza. So what might you say about this? Is this a great, say this is your favorite product. Justify.
Or say why it's not a great product.
When you get cheese stuck, like when it rotates, any cheese stuck on it.
Yeah, so like whenever I'm using this product, I notice that, it's great because it can cut through the pizza very quickly, more efficiently than I could with just like a knife or a standard pizza cutter. But it's very difficult to clean up because, unfortunately, the plastic casing is not removable, and it's very difficult to clean the circular metal blade. So being able to have some modular component where I can remove this, take out the blade, and clean that separately, maybe just run it through the dishwasher or something like that, would be very helpful. It's also very dangerous to have it like this because if you try to wash it as is, you get an electric shock because it's connected to the mechanism. And yeah, this is an absurd product, honestly, but I don't really have one. But these are things you could potentially talk about. And I don't know, do you have any more ideas about like this particular product or
Not
other
really.
ideas to highlight? No?
I mean, does anyone have any ideas for say how you might improve this product? Or are we just discarding this completely, as something consumers might want?
I can't really blame them. This thing's about perfect.
So how would you cut a pizza?
Huh?
So how would you cut a pizza?
How would I cut a pizza? I would first take out my circular saw accessory.
No, that if you discarded this product entirely.
Exactly, so you wouldn't want to discard the product entirely because then you couldn't cut your pizza. We've cornered the market. Any other questions about this type of product? Or this type of question?
Matt's now marketing this product, in case you didn't know. All right, so follow-up questions. We kind of mentioned some of these as we were going along, but for tech questions, usually they'll ask you things like, what's the runtime? Can you do better? If so, how? Or if not, why not? For something, where you've already implemented the, most optimal kind of method of doing it, then the answer is not always, yes, we can do it better, because sometimes, if you're already doing it in constant time, no, you can't really do it any faster. For design questions, things like, what if this parameter was changed, or how might we design a back end to this? If you're a PM, you're not necessarily required to know, you're not expected to actually code usually during an interview, but they might ask you, how might you structure the back end to this? So you'd say, oh, we probably have some, database like this and a front end like this that's going to sync back, and we'll use this sort of structure to hold it. Just sort of more general, higher level things about how you would translate your design into something that your developers could then actually code.
Okay. We'll talk very briefly a bit about personality and fit aspects of interviews before we move into the Q&A session of this seminar. So personality fit questions, you may find that in addition to technical questions and product questions, you're asked, hey, why are you interested in this position? Why are you interested in working with this particular company? And you do want to come prepared with an answer to this. You shouldn't just say, oh, I'm interested in working with Facebook because everyone is interviewing with Facebook, Google, and Microsoft, and I thought I should too. You want to say, oh, I think Facebook is really compelling because it's established this social network, and it's really cool that it maintains this startup feel, and also it's a web platform. It's not just a service, so it's really extensible and people can build atop it. And you might say Google, oh, I just really love being able to play Angry Birds in my browser. And so that just examples of the fact that you're aware of the company and you know what they do and you know why what they do is compelling and demonstrating that you would be a passionate individual if you were placed within the structure of their company. Talking about group projects.
Yeah, a lot of things about group projects because you will be working in teams with other people, so they want to make sure that you're not going to get put into a team and then everyone's going to hate you, or you just refuse to work with other people. So it's good to kind of think about what projects you've worked on, what roles you've taken, and kind of refresh those in your minds about what that entailed. they'll usually ask things like conflicts in group, or when have you had trouble working in a group on a project, or when were you stuck and how did you approach this, or things like if you have a conflict with your manager, how might you approach that. Basically, they want to make sure that personality-wise you will fit into their company and you will fit into a team setting without basically disrupting the entire flow of their whole team.
Okay. And following up on post-interview with recruiters?
Yeah, just ask them, when you can expect to hear back. One thing that's great about going through OCS is that they have special deadlines. So for internships, I believe it's March 11th. And for full-times, I think it's November 3rd. Which is longer than deadlines companies usually give to students. So that's something that's really nice. But you do want to email them to make sure you know when you can hear an offer from them. And then also note that you have probably a different amount of time and to decide. And if you don't hear back in the time they tell you, do feel free to email your recruiter just to make sure you haven't sort of slipped through the cracks or the email hasn't gotten lost. Things like that. It's definitely to make sure that you are getting all the information you're supposed to.
Those deadlines are only true for OCI internships.
Right.
So if you just go through something in Crimson Careers OCS, that does not necessarily apply. So you need to clarify.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good point. So those deadlines are only true for OCI interviews, which is the on-campus interviews that they do. The companies have through our OCS service, and so you want to make sure that you clarify with the company what their deadlines actually are, and if they adhere to the school's policies or not.
And with that, and as we change tapes, we'll invite our volunteer guests to come up and talk about their experiences with the internships and the interview process, and we'll join them after the transition to talk about any questions we might have.
So I interned in Microsoft this past summer. I was a PM on Windows, working on Windows 8, very exciting. The summer before, I was a software engineer at Motorola. And kind of unclear what I'm doing next year, but I've been through interviews with Google, Microsoft, and a little bit Facebook before, so feel free to ask me anything about any of those.
Hi, I'm Julia. I'm a junior psychology concentrator with the CS Secondary. And this past summer, I interned at Microsoft as a PM intern in Office 365. And recently, I've also gone through more rounds of interviews. So again, feel free to ask. Design questions are so much fun.
Cool. Hi guys, my name is Kane. I'm a senior in computer science. I've worked at Microsoft as a PM and then a local MIT startup as a designer. And my unique skill is being terrible at coding, but still doing well in the interviews. So the point here is that if you have some add value that is not your ability to code, there's design, there's industry stuff, there's marketing. That is all really valuable. So if you're a little shaky in your coding, talk to me.
Hi, my name is Joseph. I'm a sophomore studying computer science. And I think out of all the people sitting here, I am the only one who did not work at Microsoft last summer. I worked at a internet TV startup called Tivoli. And so if you have any questions about how to get a job at a startup, if you're more interested in that, I'd be the person to ask.
And I already introduced myself previously, Matt, but to get a little more background on the experience I've had, I worked at Microsoft as an intern this past summer. I've interviewed somewhat with Facebook. I've also interviewed for the APM position with Google. So any questions you might have about those particular companies or the experience working as a software developer at Microsoft, I might be able to field as well. And just to start off the process, Melissa, I don't believe you clarified your experience.
Hi, I'm Melissa. I'm a junior CS concentrator, and last summer I was also at Microsoft. I was doing the Explorer internship, so I got to do PM, Dev, and Test. So I guess I can answer little questions about those roles or the Explorer internship. I've interviewed with Microsoft and Facebook so far. So,
without further ado, let's go ahead and start taking some questions for the panel. We can just repeat the questions as we get them.
Generally speaking, at Microsoft or elsewhere, how demanding is an internship in terms of how does it compare with being at school? Like, is it a lot less work? Is it a lot more work? How different does it feel from the usual academic load?
So the question was, relative to the demands of an academic life at Harvard, how demanding is the work life experience doing an internship at somewhere like Microsoft, for example, or perhaps Facebook or Google? Does anyone have any input on this?
All right. So the work is more steady. You have whatever hours you need to do a day, but there's rarely a time where you just say, holy crap, I have no idea what's going on, like CS 124 for me. So yeah, you'll have work and you can take on as much extra work as you want, but you could easily get by just by doing the bare minimum. So that could be a plus. Not that that's not what I did, but that could be a plus or a minus. If you need a lot of pressure and stress to get your stuff done, that can be a little bit more difficult adjusting to. But you're someone that has kind of a vision and a goal, and you're active in seeking out more work. It's really cool because you're free to do as much as you want.
Can I add on to that? Yeah, like they're definitely not weekly problem sets or, like monthly essays or anything like that. There's the end goal usually that you have to accomplish a certain thing or like finish up a project. And obviously your performance is contingent upon how well you do in that. And it's up to you to make your own schedule and basically do your own work. And it can be hard, but if you are okay at planning, you should be able to get through it.
Yeah, can I add to that too? Yeah, so for example, a lot of times your manager will give you something to do and it won't be broken down or anything like that. For example, my second week, my manager was like, okay, Julia, write a feature spec. I was like, all right, what's a feature spec? So basically, and part of it is, so what I said to him, okay, then he asked, how long will it take you? And that's a very common thing. The manager asks you how long this task will take you. And basically, as long as you give a reasonable response, it's always better to keep it reasonable, but stretch it out a little bit so that you can end it early and impress them. Yeah, so basically I said, okay, let me get back to you. And then I basically found out what a feature spec was. And the next day I came back and said, okay, I now know broken down task by task what I have to do so I can give you a timeline. So that's generally how it usually works. There will be hard deadlines of like, we have to launch the product by this day, or we need to have this release out by this day. So sometimes you will have those, but very often for most of the work that you'll do, you will be setting the deadline. So.
Just to add to that, that's the only person, I guess, who worked at a startup last semester. With a startup, it's very different. I think especially working at a startup, you have a lot more deadlines and it's a lot more fast-paced because you have to build the product, you have to ship, you have to meet investor and advisor expectations. And so usually an average work week for a startup would be like anywhere between 40 and 60 hours. And you would have to expect to work like late hours. But it's very compelling because you get to see your like immediate impact on the product happen when it ships. And it's a lot of work, but at the same time, there are a lot more opportunities with a startup, and you really get to know people like the founders, the co-founders, especially if you work in a small startup. With a larger startup that starts getting a little bit larger, okay, that was a tautology. But with a slightly bigger startup, you'll start to expect like a more regular work week. But if you're trying to get into something at the very inception of the product, then expect to spend a lot of time on it.
Any additional thoughts before we move on? Okay, any other questions? Yes.
So I guess my question is for Julia. Since you're a CS secondary and you were in the PM role, can you talk about how, if any, you felt any different from the other PMs who were like primaries, like what you said, you're
So the
feel any different? What were some challenges there?
So the question was directed in particular at Julia as a CS secondary. So the question was, in the context of a PM role or in general, how did you feel different working at a tech company being someone who was not a CS concentrator or CS major?
So it's definitely slightly different. I'm not going to say that they are just, they don't ignore this fact. In fact, I'm pretty sure every interview I've had, I've been asked that at least once, as why I'm a CS secondary and not a CS concentrator. And basically, so personally, I am psychology and CS for the sake of my argument is that if I understand human behavior better, I can come up with more intuitive products. And that's completely genuinely why I did psychology and CS and not the other way around. So if you have a good reason, and that doesn't have to be the reason, it could just be, you're really interested in this topic, that's good enough, and you can tell them this, and they will want, I don't know compared to everyone else whether they asked me more harder technical questions to prove myself or something like that. As a PM, I've actually always had technical questions. I've had pretty much usually you get about 1.5. So you get one full technical interview, and then the other one will be kind of pseudo coding related to something you've designed. And I would say that and then also when you're working, it's kind of interesting because your team's like, wait, you're not CS? So it's kind of cool, though, because I think one of the best pieces of advice I got from a mentor this summer was that you are what unique value you bring to a company. And so in that sense, it actually is kind of a benefit because you are different than everyone else. And that is where you can bring your value. So I would say that it's not a bad thing at all. And in fact, you should spin it as a good thing. And as long as you have thought about it ahead of time as to why you're going to say that you did it, then it's totally fine and you'll be good to go.
Any additional questions? Yes.
So you guys working at big companies ever feel that you're not contributing as much to the product as you feel you could be if you're working at a startup? Because I've heard the story about a guy who worked at Apple who all he did the entire summer was work on one button in the taskbar.
So the question was whether or not those of us who have worked at a larger company feel that our contributions are diminished by the fact that it is such a large company working with large-scale products, as opposed to those who work at a startup. There was an additional remark, a secondhand anecdote about developers at Apple spending an entire summer working on one button in the taskbar, which I include because it's hilarious. So let's first hear from those of us who have worked at Microsoft, which might be construed as a large company, and then perhaps Joseph can push back with some thoughts about the differences working with Tivoli.
Okay, so I'll start, I guess. I think it really depends on which team you're working on. Personally, the team I was on was rather small. There were probably 20-something developers, a dozen PMs, and maybe a dozen tests. And so the entire team was, under 50, and within that team, everyone was kind of divided into even smaller projects. And for my internship, because it was an Explore internship, I was working specifically with 2 other people, and so the 3 of us owned an entire product. But even in our team, usually for each feature or for each new thing that they're releasing, it's really very dependent. Like for one of the products, my mentor and 2 other developers were the only ones working on it. And so the 3 of them owned that project. Obviously, for a bigger team, for something like Windows 8, obviously because it's such a big product, then each person probably has a much smaller, role in it because it also has a much bigger audience, and so they want to make sure that each feature is exactly perfect and will sell well to the general audience and to consumers, and it's flawless. And so in that case, they might be only working on, say, one button or one menu bar, but...
So I actually worked on a button for a song. And but the feeling is this, is if you have a massive enterprise level product, there's no way that a single human being understands all of it or even half of it. Our database had something on the order of 10,000 rows and talked to about 5 or 6 other products. So once you scale to that size, it's really impossible to, unless you're a visionary like Steve Jobs, where Apple controls the entire vertical of their technology. The trade-off, though, is that that if you design this feature, there's about how many millions of users that are going to be using it. So if you screw up, well, then people are going to hate you anonymously, but it's still not a very good feeling. So there's incentive there to do well, and you're trading off between how much knowledge you have of the product as a whole, and how many people you are affecting by designing a small feature. And I'm sure Joe will give you the other side of that. So
Before that, I definitely want to chime in alongside Kane in thinking about the scope of what you're working on. I think it's very important not to just think of the number of features you're looking at individually, but the impact of any changes you make on however small a feature. For example, at a company like Microsoft, since many of us seem to have considerable experience with this company, it's a huge corporation. But they have many different interests. You can work on Xbox, you can work on phone, you can work on Windows, you can work on Windows Azure, you can work on Microsoft Office. There are a lot of different things that you can get into, and then you're dividing the company up into smaller parts that are working on different things. And then within that, you have smaller teams which are working on particular aspects. And in particular, I was working on the Windows operating system, which has a lot of lines of code, and no one can possibly know what's going on at each different spot. So you have certain teams that are experts at different components. And so specifically, I was working on remote file systems and the file server technology in the file server technology wing, and working on bug fixes for problems in the Windows 7, the way Windows 7 handles file servers and sharing files across networks and dealing with concurrency errors with that. So that's a very limited scope of a very large product, a very large operating system, but I was also working on patches that would deploy on hundreds of thousands, if not millions of machines. So while you may be working on a very small component, or not if you're in a large company, the experience will vary very much depending on the team you're on. You can also think, okay, so I'm working on a small aspect of this, but it has a huge impact because a lot of different people are using that. Right, and Joseph will push back, I imagine.
Push back. Well, actually, to be honest, so I think the difference between startups and small teams and corporations is that with a corporation, the scope of like how many people you're affecting is a lot larger. But the product you're working on is a much smaller subset of the entire product. Whereas with a startup, you might have less users using your product because, of course, you're not as big as a corporation, but you get to flesh out the entire product. And every single thing that every single user uses when they're using your product is exactly built by you. For example, I worked at Tivoli, and I was their first design engineer, and I still am their only employee. And so it's a small startup, but it's getting nice venture funding and things like that. But so what I got to do on the product was I basically built the entire front end. So if anyone uses Tivoli, every single thing that they see on the page, in terms of aesthetic look and in terms of user design, was built solely by me. And I think that's very different from, for example, someone that's just working on Facebook pages, for example. Even though that team might be kind of small, only a limited subset. It's a smaller part of the bigger product. I mean, when people use Facebook, they don't necessarily use Facebook pages. And I feel like being able to say that every single user, will interact with something that I've built means that I've made a larger impact on the product as a whole. And for me, it's a lot more exciting to do something like that because in future iterations, your work is always going to be carried through. So when the startup becomes big, if it succeeds, you'll know that you're always going to be a part of that product. And, in the long run, you're actually impacting the millions of users that will use it afterward. Okay.
Hi guys, I'm Neil. I'm a sophomore. I worked at Facebook in the summer before college, actually. And then in the winter last year, I worked at Rapleaf. Yeah. And this past summer, I actually tried out finance. I went to Jump Trading in Chicago. So, yeah. All right.
Okay, next question. Over here. So the question was, how did your first interview go? This is a good question. Anyone want to jump in first?
Like first interview ever?
Technical related, I think. So how did your first technical interview go?
So as the computer science concentrator that can't really code, this is always funny. And so the advice I would give is, if you don't know what's going on, use humor. And I got a question from a guy with a British accent and a stutter that I just did not understand. And the British accent and the stutter is my excuse. I just actually didn't understand the technical part of it either. So he asked me how to make it faster, and I said, well, add more RAM. And that buys you time to think. So it was actually the square root question. And you'll stumble, and then you'll start to think, oh, I'm stupid, and I'm not going to do this, and I'm completely failing, and you're just going to dig yourself a deeper and deeper hole and fail. So if you do that, so the goal is to know that you're basically on a level playing field, even if you're not, convince yourself that you are, and just be confident. Confidence is key, humor is key. If you have the technical parts to back it up, that's even better. But if you're like me and you're a little weak on that, charm them, tell jokes, be confident, and it works.
So my first interview was with Facebook, and I can definitely say that I was a bit nervous about it, but in the end, it ended up being like pretty relaxed. Like, I think the most important thing is to relax and, to be confident, like Haynes said. And also, like, if they ask you a question, if you know the answers, then say it with confidence. But if you don't know the answer, it's totally fine to say, I don't know that. I'm still learning. Like, I have still things to learn, because they don't expect you to know everything. Like, they just want to see that you can use what you do know to make, good solutions to problems, that sort of thing. So, the most important thing is just to show what you know, and not to try to pretend that you know something you don't.
To add on to that, definitely don't try to fake it. I had my first interview right after CS50, and when I got to the technical interview, I can't even remember what the question was, but it was about how to code something that I had never even heard of. Like it was like, I don't know, I think it was some sort of somewhat obscure data structure. And so I said, oh, I'm sorry, actually we've never covered that in class. Could you explain it to me? And the guy actually, I think, was just not interested in that, so he was like, okay, fine, I'll just give you a linked list question. And and then it ended up working out fine. So in the sense that if there is something you don't know, it is really not the end of the world if you don't know it. And they just try to tailor so that they know like what your maximum knowledge is. So.
I'm actually struggling to remember which my first interview was and like how it went. It was probably fine. I don't know. But I think the one thing that I would definitely recommend is interviewing with as many companies as possible, even if you're not interested in them. Like, it's definitely a waste of time, or it can be seen as a waste of time. No. It can be seen as a waste of time. It's actually not, because it's good to get a lot of practice. So then in the end, like, you just start forgetting how many interviews you've done with whom, but you just gain a lot of confidence. You're basically preparing yourself for companies you actually care about, and this probably is really awful. You're like wasting resources, but it doesn't matter. It's okay, just do it.
Definitely a good point, and signing up for a bunch of interviews can be really helpful, especially if you're nervous about one big one, and then you can have a couple coding interviews before then. I may have done this with some companies this semester. I will confide in the room that my first tech interview did not go very well at all. So I interviewed for an internship with a Google APM position last year, and I was bumped from my interview and ended up doing a phone interview. It was my first tech interview I had ever had, and the fact that it was a phone interview made me even more nervous about it. So I choked into some of the questions. I stumbled a little bit. I didn't do entirely badly. I mean, I was delivering answers on the questions, but I was very uncertain about how my answers were being perceived. I couldn't read the body language of the interviewer, and I came away from it just a little rattled. And I ended up using that experience. I thought about what I did wrong, what didn't go well. I talked to other people who had done interviews of the same type and with the same company. I figured out, okay, when I was thinking like this, I should have been thinking about this. I should have approached the question from this perspective. And then I went on and I did other interviews with other companies and with the same company for other positions, and I tended to do better. And each time I did an interview, I did a little better because I understood more of what was expected of me, and I had a better idea of how to present myself in a way which would appeal to the interviewer and show them I knew what I was talking about and that I had what they were looking for in that position. So You'll have interviews that don't go as well as others do, and that's something to be expected, and it's something to welcome because it's just part of the process and it's part of being a fallible individual. And you don't know everything. Some of you know a lot. Maybe you won't have such bad experiences in any of your interviews, but it's okay if occasionally you find an interview where things just don't go very well, it's not what you wanted, because there's always opportunities to do better later. And you can always, if you start early and are applying for internships, you can reapply for a full-time position later, and they'll certainly entertain you after you've had more experience interviewing and working with other companies. So essentially, don't be afraid of failure. It happens to all of us. And use every interview you have as a learning experience and come away from it a better interviewee. Other questions?
I'll just give one last anecdote. So when I was interviewing, my first question was, given a single link list, reverse it. I was like, great, this is perfect. I just taught this in section. I know my single link list, like forwards and backwards. This will be fine. I was like, I'm going to do a recursive, function. I start writing it. And then halfway through, I realized my implementation will lose every single node except the last one. And so at this point, I kind of panicked a little because I was like, okay, wait, actually, I realized my implementation will not work and will lose every single node. So I had to sit there and basically backtrack and think of a different implementation. And I was just sitting there freaking out a little bit. But the takeaway is that it's okay if your first one fails. Just make sure you sit there, think through it, and then come up with a solution that does work, because in the end, it was fine. I got my next round interview and whatever. But I did walk out of it thinking that I just done miserably, and, there's no way the company is ever going to want to see my face again because I can't even, reverse a single link list. So it's totally fine. Also, I learned not to, try and do so many recursive functions. In a later interview, I did a recursive function that called a helper function, which is also recursive. Then my interviewer asked me, why is this bad? I was like, well, once we get to a big enough list, we're going to have Stack Overflow. He was like, okay, so change your functions. So, yeah, recursion's not always good, but it's okay. In the end, it'll work out. Other questions, I guess?
I'm curious as to why so many of you, I guess, chose to work for Microsoft, and are there actually tangible cultural differences between companies?
So to just address this right off the bat, the question was, I'm curious why so many of you chose to work for Microsoft. There may be a slight selection bias here because Melissa and I organized this event. We worked at Microsoft, and when we were thinking of people who have worked at companies before, we of course first thought of all our friends who worked at Microsoft and the people we knew who we had met through working at Microsoft. And obviously these people were also most willing to help us because we did know them more personally. But the second part of the question was, what about Microsoft attracted us as opposed to other companies? Or
If there are actual tangible cultural differences between companies?
Okay, and to clarify, the meat of the question being, what are the tangible cultural differences between the big companies that people generally consider coming out of Harvard? Okay, anyone want to try fielding that?
Yeah, maybe I'll speak sort of in general terms. I think there definitely are. I think that's a huge reason of why you interview and you have a second round where you generally will go to the company. Some companies do phone interviews. I think it's really stupid. First of all, I like to travel on someone else's credit. But second of all, I think it's just hugely important to see the company, what the buildings are like, what the people are like, sometimes you walk into a building and you feel like there's this oppressed, very sad feeling here. I don't want to be here. Did not happen. But sometimes, as in the case of me and Microsoft, for instance, last year when I was applying, I didn't actually think I really wanted to work there. I thought I wanted to work for Google. Then when I actually came for my second round, I really, really enjoyed Microsoft. I really enjoyed everyone I interviewed with, and I genuinely had fun. So I think once you get through your second interview, you get a pretty good feel for what the culture is like, and you can compare your different experiences.
And this is more of a logistic thing, so people view thinking between Microsoft, Google, and other large companies. Google lives in its own little temporal universe where time travels 3 times slower. So if you're scheduling interviews, they will screw up multiple times and miss deadlines. So keep that in mind. I'm sure many of us had the same experience, but if you're interviewing in parallel, Google will always screw up and miss the final deadline for the other company. So I went to Microsoft, and Microsoft, it turned out, if you think about it, Microsoft doesn't have as many sexy consumer products, but they still run the world. Embedded systems, databases, everything, and just being a part of something so like important to how the world runs was important to me. There's opportunities at a lot of smaller places where the people are cooler, the building is shinier, but you won't really be doing things that affect as many people. They really solve kind of first world problems, like I need to figure out how to take pictures of my food better and share it with everyone. Which is food spotting, and they do interview if you're interested. So think about what you want to do, and specifically between Google and Microsoft, the culture is actually really similar. Google's buildings are slightly shinier, but having interviewed with both, not that much that's different. So.
Yeah, I guess one thing that's tangibly different between Google and Microsoft is just like you can tell not even interviewing with them is the kinds of products they work on. So like, I mean, Google is like a lot of web stuff. They have their Chrome OS now, but like if you want to do like desktop applications, that's like Windows or that's Microsoft more. It's like a larger sphere. I don't know.
And another thing to think about is the consumers for your products. So I guess just contrasting these big companies again, in Microsoft, every product does go to the consumer and is made to be sold. At Google, pretty much all of their revenue comes in from ads, some from phones. But because that there is kind of a cultural difference in the products you're making, at Microsoft, it is sort of we want to make a product that sells, that the customers will be happy with. At Google, like if a product does not, go over well, we can kind of kill it and just move on to a next product. So depending on which way, works better for you and you like more, that might, change the way that you see a company. Like whether you like having something, that always like is, revenue generating, or if you like having the ability to work on a product and if it doesn't work, then it's fine. We just move on. So that is something that is also, I think, different about these companies.
Sorry, just to add on a note, I think a good metaphor is like college. Like when you're choosing between college and you go on your campus tour and you get there and you're like, oh wow, now I understand the vibe. So that's another to add on to Olga's earlier point about going to the company. If you do get that opportunity, definitely take it because it can absolutely change the way you think about it.
A lot of the differences between the limiting the scope of my view to the three companies that are perhaps the largest ones that Harvard students look at often because they do on-campus interviewing. Not Harvard. Facebook, Microsoft, and Google. You can sort of think of them as existing on a spectrum in terms of their interests in different types of platforms and different types of products. I would say Facebook is the most limited in that its focus, and not saying limiting is bad, saying it's limited in that it's looking at one platform and one website. It's building its own platform. This one website called Facebook, it does a lot of things, but the idea is they want everyone to come to Facebook and use these and build upon their platform, which they're making extensible. So they want people to spend a lot of time there instead of going to Google and searching for things or going somewhere else to find content. They want to aggregate all this content on top of their social network. Google is limited in the sense that it's working mostly from the web platform. They are moving beyond this somewhat in that Android is becoming very popular. Chrome OS is at least out there, uncertain whether or not that's going to be something that's thriving or not, but they are working on an operating system. Some of your friends might have Chromebooks, so there's some interesting things happening there that they're developing outward with. Microsoft perhaps has the most diverse interests, and Microsoft has a reputation actually of being a fast follower in that as soon as an industry becomes big, Microsoft will get into it. So for example, the iPod became huge, and soon after we saw the Zune come out and Microsoft attempting that. Game consoles were very big in the late 90s, early 2000s, and Microsoft came out with the Xbox product and started exploring that and had become very successful. So Microsoft is notable in that it has a wide range of interests and it has many billion-dollar industries contained within itself. So if you're interested in working exclusively on the web platform and you're interested in working on a particular product, Facebook might be a good fit. The culture is sort of, if you're just interested in the web platform as a whole, maybe Google, and if you're interested in working on a variety of different, perhaps client-side products, Microsoft might have more culture you're looking for. So the culture can be dictated in a lot of ways by the sort of products which the company creates, which actually is very diverse, even looking at some companies that are very popular with a lot of people here. Another thing in terms of the differences in culture of the companies, just looking between, let's say, Microsoft and Google, for example, companies I've visited, I haven't been to Facebook. Anyone who has more experience with Facebook can speak more to this, and I can speak as to what I've heard about it. You can also look at this as sort of like a linear transition in terms of how startup-y it feels. So Microsoft doesn't feel very startup-y. You get your own office and you can work in that. That might sound really cool to you. I get my own office. Or you might be like, oh no, I want to be out there on the floor working with all the developers and developing. So it's kind of like what you're looking for. Facebook, my understanding is that they have a bunch of people out in the same room together working on a lot of on different things, and they can collaborate very easily. And Google's somewhere in between, whereas some people, if they have roles where they need to be on the phone a lot, they might have their office, and other people are kind of out there on the floor, and they have all their desks near each other, and they don't really have cubicles. It's kind of like a free, open environment, and they have like stuffed animals hanging from the ceiling and like fun, colorful things everywhere, and like all their conference rooms are named after movies and stuff like that. So it's sort of the feel in terms of that sort of like expressive culture also varies between the three. So it's all in terms of what you're looking for, you might want to consider along both of those spectrums in terms of making a decision about the companies you want to apply with. Any additional thoughts?
Right. So with a startup, it's very different, of course. So when you're working at a big corporation and like you're getting into it and you're like, oh, it's going to be great, and then you show up. Oh, sorry. And then you show up and you're like, I actually hate everyone on my team, and every time I want to talk to my manager, I want to like punch him in the face. Like, for a corporation, it's okay because there are a lot of other people around you, right? And of course, if you don't like the people on your team, you can of course just go find someone else that's like on another team to like hang out with or like socialize with. With a startup, when you have 5 to 10 people working on one product, you see them every single day. And this is why like culture is vitally important in a startup, because you can't like get away from the people that are around you. You have to work with them on a consistent basis, and you're all working together on like the beginnings of the product. So you can't avoid like interacting with each other. So during the interview process for startups, you'll usually find that you'll really get to like meet the founders, the co-founders, things like that, the lead engineers, and you'll really get a good sense of whether you're a good fit for the culture at that particular startup. And I think you should really choose wisely which startup you want to work for. If you choose to work for a startup, like you should very heavily weigh culture into that fit. So like, for example, a startup that one of my friends interviewed for, the final interview was, okay, let's go have a beer with the guys and see if you like actually fit in with them. And for the other one was like, come to our weekly StarCraft like gaming night and see if you like can beat all our other players. So I mean, it like these are of course like extreme examples, but I mean, working for a startup is very different, so you should consider that cultural fit very, very heavily.
I'm pretty sure most companies don't actually require that you're in Diamond League, so don't worry too much. We have, I think, enough time to take about one more brief question. Anyone want to throw one in? Back here in the white.
How long is an hour? Because like you said, you were talking a while ago about these interviews being like an hour long. And if I have no technical experience besides taking CS50, how am I going to talk for an hour? Am I going to be asked a lot of questions, or how does that all work?
Okay, so the question was how is the time in an hour-long interview split up? So, for example, if you're having a technical interview and you're being asked to work for an hour on some problem, how do you really fill that time if you don't necessarily have the technical knowledge to just keep talking about the problem for that long? So, in an hour-long interview, you likely have a couple of questions thrown at you rather than just one, and it'll be more of a dialogue with the interviewer rather than just you going on a monologue and talking about all the aspects of the problem. So you don't need to worry about being able to pull from a large background and just talking about a bunch of things for that long. The time will be filled by the process of interacting with the interviewer. And it's normally not that difficult to fill the time. Does anyone have any comments that sort of like reassuring about, yes?
So yeah, I would definitely say it's more of a conversation than you trying to like talk about things that you know for an hour, just trying to impress the interviewer. It's definitely more of like a back and forth conversation. You'll have, maybe like 3, 4, 2, maybe even 2 or 5 problems given to you by the interviewer. And depending on, how complicated the problems are, how long they take, you make it more or less. But generally they'll try to control the time and make sure that the time like fits in the hour. But also another thing to consider is that a lot of the time is not actually doing problems. A lot of it is just you talking to them about their company, asking about their company, asking why they want to work there, asking why you should work there, and just trying to see, if it's a good company for you, if it's a good fit. So, like, you're definitely not spending the entire hour just talking about technical things. Yeah.
Yeah, and in a lot of cases, when you have like a lot of back-to-back interviews, it'll probably be closer to more like 45 minutes. And then in those 15 minutes, usually your interviewer will talk to the other interviewers and they kind of confer about you and the other interviewees. And often they expect that you'll improve throughout your interviews. So for example, if during your first interview, you missed border cases because you forgot to test against, a good example, then in your second one, it's probably good to remember that and, show that you are able to take feedback and improve upon that. And also, when you're actually like writing code on a whiteboard and explaining and talking through your process, time actually goes pretty fast. Like you can end up spending, 20, 30 minutes on like 20 lines of code just because you're explaining it, talking through it, talking about, if it's the best algorithm, if, you can do better, doing test cases on it, making sure it covers your edge cases, things like that. So a thorough, even a simple example will easily take you like the entirety of the interview.
Yeah, and oftentimes you'll start with like the test cases, for example, and that can take a while. Like I had a question recently that was write a program that would determine whether two rectangles were intersecting, and if so, then how much were they intersecting by on a two-dimensional plane, which is a really interesting question because it's really simple to say, and then when you start thinking about it, it's much more complicated than it sounds. Not much, but it's more complicated. But so, for example, like in the way I started that out was, okay, what are all the different ways that rectangles can intersect, and what are their different properties? And when you start getting into solving the problem like that, I think I ended up not writing more than like 10 lines of code for that. And I don't think I've ever written more than 10 lines of code in a tech interview, even though it was an entire hour, because you will spend a lot of time going through your thought process. And so you shouldn't worry about filling that time because it will be filled. And don't worry about like having too many questions because I think 5 is probably a good, like you probably won't get more than 5. So, yeah.
That's actually a good point. If you're stuck on something in a tech interview, don't just kind of stand there and go, because then they don't know if it's because you don't know what a rectangle is or you're caught up, or you're trying to figure out some weird exotic corner case. So like Julia said, think out loud, talk about what you're thinking. Oh, these are rectangles, and maybe you understand geometric math really well, but you can't code that well. So really use that strength and explain what your thought process is, because it turns out that if you read the right page in a book, you can get lucky and write the code down. But if you can show that you can think laterally around this to a solution or towards a solution, that's much more important.
Well, for those that maybe not so much technical interviews, but product management interviews, generally you'll have enough time to elaborate on the product and they'll keep asking you about like edge cases. For example, Melissa and Julia might talk, like they interviewed at Microsoft, and one of the questions was, how do you design an elevator? And one of my friends who also interviewed at Microsoft, the focus of that particular interview was like on the security of the elevator. So it was basically an interview where you would propose a solution to a problem that the interviewer had given you, and then they would propose even more like hacky ways to get around your particular security flaw. I mean, your particular solution. They would keep exposing flaws, and you would have to consistently come up with solutions to fix those flaws. And I mean, in a product management interview, that's generally the case. They'll keep asking you to iterate over the product. And I mean, it's sort of at the end of the 1 hour time slot, how much have you taken your original design and how much have you improved it by the end. So you will be able to fill up the hour because, I mean, no design is ever perfect. So that iteration, that step will continue through the entire process. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. And with that, we'll conclude the Q&A session and move toward wrapping all this up. Let's hear it for these guys who volunteered to come in on a Friday afternoon, by the way, on relatively short notice. Thank you guys so much for volunteering. It was nice having you here for a conversation with all of us. Just to wrap things up, There is more to come, so if you're interested in learning more about how to address particular technical interview questions, there is a seminar being run through by one of the CS50TFs named Tony Ho called Acing Your Technical Interview. So if you go to cs50.net/register, you can register to attend that, and I highly recommend that you do if you're interested in learning more about how to solve these problems with these linked lists or any of these other structures you might see. And please, though unfortunately there's relatively few remaining at the very end, maybe we should have put this up at the very beginning, but if you could provide us feedback at this link, if you have a laptop open, just want to type URL, or maybe just like jot this down. I'll leave it on the screen for a little while. Just like 3 or 4 questions. Just What's that? Yes. Yeah, just any information you might want to provide about what you'd like to see in the future, since we would like to provide additional events and provide more guidance, possibly going so far as offering mock interviews, since mock interviews at Harvard have traditionally been more guided toward providing guidance on slightly redundant, but on consulting and finance, and we'd like to see more of a culture of providing a robust technical support. So any information about things you'd like to see of that nature would be very helpful to us, so we appreciate any input you can provide. All right, thanks very much, and we will be giving up this room, but thank you for coming in and joining us for this afternoon, and have a great weekend. Bye.